Jacob had never thought much about the sky. Not until the morning the police cruiser pulled up beside his lakeside yard. His daughter was running barefoot through the grass, holding a neon orange kite that snapped and dipped in the wind. The breeze carried laughter, string, and silence until it didn't. The officer stepped out slowly, glancing at a clipboard, not even looking up at first. "You the homeowner?" Jacob nodded, confused. "Everything all right?" The man didn't smile. "We got a complaint." "A complaint?" The board member trailing behind the officer had his arms crossed and a clipboard of his own. Jacob recognized him vaguely. Something about newsletters and monthly warnings about trash bins left out too long. The officer looked unsure, as if reading from a script he didn't believe in. Something about the kite, being disruptive. Jacob turned to see his daughter stopping mid-spin. The kite sagged slightly in the wind as the officer gestured to it. "They said it's interfering with lakefront harmony." Jacob laughed once, dry and soft. "You're serious?" The board member stepped forward. "There's a safety clause, line 3.7 under outdoor recreational nuisances. Stringed devices longer than 25 feet from ground level require board approval." Jacob squinted at him. "You called the cops, over a toy kite." The man didn't blink. "We warned you once already." There was a note. There had been a paper folded on his porch a few days ago. No signature, just print. "Unapproved. Airborne activity may result in penalties." He'd thought it was a joke, like the old man in the woods who once reported someone for fishing too loudly. Apparently it was protocol. The officer shifted awkwardly, then glanced at Jacob's daughter, who was now standing still, holding the kite string like it was something dangerous. "I'm not issuing anything," the officer said quickly, "but I do need you to take it down. Just to keep the peace." Jacob looked at the string, then, at his daughter. He gently walked over and helped her reel it in, even as her eyes welled with quiet confusion. After the officer and board member left, the yard felt colder, like the wind had shifted in a way that wasn't natural. Later that evening, Jacob sat on the porch. The sky was still a clear canvas. Empty now. He thought about the absurdity of IT police paperwork over something as harmless as a kite. But it wasn't about the kite. It was about something else. The way the board member had looked at him, like they were allowed to decide what could touch the sky and what couldn't, as the moon rose over the lake. Jacob's eyes drifted across the shoreline. From the far end, past the tree line, a structure stretched into the water. A dock, not his. He'd seen it before, of course, but tonight, for the first time, it felt out of place, like it was leaning too far, reaching into land it didn't belong to. He stood, walked down the slope, and followed the shoreline. His bare feet crushed the soft moss as he moved closer. The dock was long, lined with wooden planks and signs about rental times, liability warnings, and access rules. But what caught his eye was something at the base. A stone flat, heavy, half buried with a rusted iron stake protruding from the ground nearby. He crouched. The stake was old, weathered by years of rain and sun. Something in him stirred. A faint memory of the property map. A line, a corner. He didn't touch it. Not yet. He just stood again and looked at the dock from a new angle. The way it sat, the way it extended, the way it felt just slightly wrong. As he walked back up to the house, one thought followed him like a shadow. They were drawing lines, but maybe they didn't know where the real ones were. The next morning, the lake was still. A low fog crawled across its surface like breath over glass. Jacob stood on the edge of his property, arms crossed, staring at the dock that jutted into the water like a limb outstretched beyond its joint. He wasn't angry, not yet, but something had settled in his mind, stubborn and quiet. A kind of curiosity that didn't like being ignored. He remembered the deed, vaguely. He'd skimmed it when they first bought the property. Something about shoreline rights, easements, setbacks, the usual jargon. But last night had changed how he saw things. He walked the shoreline again, this time slower. The same stake poked up near the base of the dock, but now he searched for a second opposite, inland. It took him 15 minutes to find it. A similar iron rod, buried behind an overgrown patch of sedge, nearly swallowed by time. He imagined a string between them, connecting the line. Then he stepped back and looked at the dock. It wasn't aligned with the rest of the neighborhood's structures. That much was clear now. It cut across the imaginary line. Slightly, but definitely. He didn't draw conclusions. Not yet. He just snapped a few photos on his phone and went back inside. That afternoon, He tried something simple. He logged onto the county assessor's website, pulled up his parcel, and stared at the map. It was crude pixelated, but still, the outline was there. Clear borders. A long curve of land that wrapped partway around the lake. The HOA's dock was sitting smack against the boundary line, possibly over it. He zoomed in. The screen fuzzed with blocks, too vague to confirm anything, but it was enough to push the curiosity into something heavier. He printed the map, folded it into his coat pocket and drove 10 miles to the county records office. Inside, the woman behind the counter barely looked up as he spoke. Lot 12, he said, parcel 4C. I need the full plot records. And if you have it, the last official survey. She sighed, pushed up her glasses, and disappeared behind a wall of drawers. When she returned, she had a manila folder thick with age. He spent the next hour at a table by the window, tracing lines with his finger. His shoreline bent in a wide arc. The public access dock, the one the HOA managed, was labeled ... But barely, just a dotted line. No permits attached. No notations. Then he noticed it, a small discrepancy between the dock's registered position and the actual boundary of his lot. On paper, the dock crossed over. Not by a little, nearly 28 feet. He felt it like a shift in gravity when he left the building. The sun was already low, casting gold across the lake. But the colors didn't matter. Something had been sitting where it shouldn't have. For years, probably, and if his measurements were right, the board that called the cops over his daughter's kite had spent a decade managing a structure on his property, collecting money from it, writing rules around it, without asking, without realizing, or maybe, knowing. When he got home, he stood at the edge of the yard again. The dock was still there, unmoved and silent in the still water, but it looked different now, like a trespasser that hadn't yet realized it had been caught. Jacob didn't say anything to his wife that night. He didn't need to. He just left the folder open on the table, maps spread across the wood like a quiet threat. Tomorrow, he thought, they'll know I saw it, and then we'll see what they do. Morning light bled through the kitchen windows, soft and yellow. Jacob sat alone at the table, sipping coffee and rereading the survey report. The numbers hadn't changed overnight. The dock was over the line. By a full 28 feet, the HOA's structure trespassed onto his land. He folded the pages again, slid them into an envelope, and sealed it without writing a return address. He didn't need his name on the front, not yet. What mattered was what was inside. By noon, the envelope was sitting in the HOA office drop box, a quiet delivery with no knock, no warning. He didn't wait around, just walked back to his truck and drove off. The next day passed in silence. No calls, no visits. But on the second, a white envelope arrived in his mailbox. Inside was a notice, thin, impersonal, typed with clinical formality, notice of violation, unauthorized shoreline modification. Jacob read it twice. He hadn't modified anything. The accusation didn't even make sense. There had been no construction, no digging, nothing new. He stood there in the driveway, staring at the notice while a light breeze stirred across the lake. It wasn't just wrong, it was intentional. A deflection. The board had received his documents, and instead of a reply, they'd answered with paper of their own. He scanned the rest of the letter. The language was vague, barely citing any actual infraction, just enough to place blame without proof. The kind of warning meant to discourage, not inform. Later that afternoon, Jacob walked the edge of the property again. The dock sat still in the water, its sun-bleached boards cracked from years of use. A family of ducks drifted beneath its shadow. From a distance it looked innocent, but now it seemed like something else, an intruder planted by quiet ambition, and years of overlooked boundaries. He took more pictures. Angled shots from the property staked to the waterline. He dug up the second iron marker and cleaned the rust with a wire brush, exposing the engraved initials that matched his survey. There was no mistake. That night, Jacob typed up a new letter. This time, it wasn't just documentation, it was a formal cease and desist. He stated the coordinates, cited the records, attached both the old county map and the recent survey. And he gave them 10 days to remove the dock or face legal action. He didn't threaten, just informed. When he finished, he signed it, sealed the envelope, and delivered it the next morning. No one came out to meet him, but he saw the blinds shift in the HOA office as he walked back to his truck. 2 days passed, then, a man in a gray suit knocked on Jacob's door. Not a neighbor. Not someone from the board. "I represent the HOA," the man said calmly. "I'd like to speak with you privately." Jacob let him in, but said nothing. The man sat on the edge of the couch and pulled out a thin folder. "We'd like to resolve this without unnecessary conflict," he said. "There's no conflict," Jacob replied. "Just trespass." The man smiled politely, slid a document across the table. "A proposed easement, simple language. Allows for shared use of the structure. No financial exchange. Just formality. You sign it. We'll consider the matter resolved." Jacob didn't touch the paper. He looked the man in the eye and said one word. "No." The man nodded, as if he expected it, then stood. "You may want to reconsider." Jacob didn't see him out. He just waited until the door closed and looked back at the folder sitting on the table. They knew now, and they weren't going to move the dock. Which meant he would have to buy the 5th day. The deadline on Jacob C. Sandus's letter passed without a word, no email, no letter, no movement on the dock. The structure remained just as it was, thick wooden beams casting shadows over the water, floating on territory that wasn't theirs. A monument to how long they thought they could act without being challenged. Jacob didn't make a second call. He didn't send reminders. He wasn't waiting anymore. That morning, he walked to the edge of his property with a pair of chain cutters and a steel padlock. At the narrow gravel trail that led to the dock's main access, he installed a fresh metal gate, drove posts deep into the dirt, and hung a small wooden sign. Private access, no trespassing, no decoration, no explanations. Just truth. He didn't need to yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply redrew the line, this time in steel and certainty. He returned to his porch, poured a cup of coffee, and waited. It didn't take long. By mid-afternoon, 2 board members showed up, their truck pulling into the common lot just past the trail. The man from earlier, short, glasses perched on his nose. And a woman Jacob hadn't seen before, clipboard in hand, sunglasses hiding her eyes. They walked up to the new gate slowly, speaking in hushed voices. The man rattled the chain once, then stepped back. They didn't knock, they didn't speak to Jacob, they just left, but the message had been sent. That evening, Jacob received a letter, hand-delivered by a courier. This one wasn't printed on the usual white HOA letterhead. It was marked from a law office. He opened it slowly. Demand for immediate removal of obstruction to community property access. The letter claimed his gate interfered with communal resources, and accused him of malicious restriction of shared amenities. It quoted bylaws and codes, twisting language to suggest the dock somehow belonged to all. Regardless of where it physically stood, it was dressed in legal terms, but Jacob saw it clearly a bluff wrapped in citations. They were pretending the maps didn't exist, but they did, and he had more than copies. He had the original surveyor ready to testify. He had dated records from county files. And he had the one thing no paper could erase, the land itself. The next day, he went a step further. He hired a locksmith and sealed the rental shed at the far end of the dock, the one the HOA had used for years to store jet ski keys and paddles. He changed the lock, left no note, and walked away. He could have stopped there. But Jacob knew something was shifting. The more pressure he applied, the more cracks formed beneath the surface of their quiet authority. 2 days later, a stranger parked across the road from his house, sat in the car for 30 minutes, windows rolled up, doing nothing, just staring at the lake. Then he left. Jacob wasn't worried. He was documenting everything. Dates, times, photos, plates. That evening, a letter arrived in his inbox, not from the HOA, but from a neighbor 3 lots down. It was short. "I saw what you did. About time someone stood up. Let me know if you need anything." Jacob read it twice. He looked out the window again at the dock, still floating, still unmoved, but now stripped of its purpose. For years, the board had made decisions as if the lake belonged to them. Now, for the first time, they were realizing something. They'd never wanted to face it did in single quotes T, and neither did the land beneath their feet. By the end of the week, Jacob no longer walked the shoreline to check. He already knew nothing had changed. The dock remained, the board remained silent. But beneath that silence, something was shifting. He could feel it in the sideways glances from neighbors who once avoided eye contact, in the hesitation of the HOA president's truck, pausing longer than usual near his driveway. They were watching now, waiting, but Jacob wasn't waiting anymore. He was preparing. He reached out to a property attorney. Not the kind who worked out of shopping centers or billed hourly to send empty letters. This one specialized in land disputes, boundary claims, Quiet title actions. Jacob sent over the maps, surveys, photos, and letters. Everything that the attorney read in silence, then leaned back and spoke without pause. You have a case, a good one. Not just for removal, but for damages. Jacob hadn't thought that far, but the lawyer explained. If the HOA had used that dock for revenue, which the rental shed and public signage suggested, and if they had done so without proper rights, they had been trespassing for years, not just physically, financially. He left the office with a new file. Inside it was the first draft of a formal complaint. But before filing, Jacob gave the HOA one final chance. He hand-delivered the document, placed it on the receptionist's desk, and said just one thing. 7 days, then it's court. The receptionist didn't respond, just looked down, hands stiff, as if she already knew what was coming. That evening, someone knocked on Jacob's door. It wasn't the board. It was a resident, an older man named Harris, who lived across the cove. He held a brown envelope, and looked tired. I don't like what they've done, Harris said, voice low, and I thought you should see this. Inside were old newsletters, HOA archives, meeting minutes from over a decade ago. One entry stood out, a line about dock expansion approved in emergency vote, no public review due to season schedule. Attached was a crude drawing of the expansion pushing the dock into territory it never had before. Jacob leaned back, staring at the date. 12 years ago, they knew. They had expanded the dock quietly, bypassing public review, assuming no one would ever challenge it. Jacob looked up. Why are you giving me this? Harris shook his head. Because I voted for it. Back then didn't question it, thought it was harmless. I didn't know it was your land. But they did. The weight of that sentence pressed down harder than Jacob expected. The next day, Jacob's attorney filed the formal complaint. Trespass, unlawful use, financial recovery, injunction for immediate removal. It wasn't just a letter now, it was action. The board didn't respond directly, but a sudden wave of activity swirled at the dock. 2 men in uniforms arrived, began taking photographs and measuring distances with laser tools. They didn't speak to Jacob, but they didn't have to. They were assessing damage, trying to get ahead of the paperwork. It was too late. The following week, a small notice appeared on the HOA's digital bulletin. Dock usage temporarily suspended due to pending property clarification. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a retreat dressed in neutral words. Jacob didn't post a reply. He didn't speak at meetings. He simply removed the gate, left the lock on the shed, and waited. The lake was quiet again. The wind light, the stillness wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the moment before something breaks, and Jacob knew exactly where the cracks would form. The dock sat empty now, and yet it carried more weight than ever. No one walked it, no one rented from it. The gate Jacob had installed had been taken down, but no one had dared to use the structure since the legal filing. It had gone from the neighborhood's prized access point to a stranded monument cut off, isolated, and avoided like something toxic. And still, the board refused to speak his name in public. Jacob watched from his porch, arms crossed, as the HOA officials walked the trail one afternoon, stopping a few feet from where his property line began. They looked at the shed, then at the survey markers. One took out a phone. The other jotted something down. Neither stepped forward. They left without touching a thing. That night, the HOA held an emergency board meeting. The agenda was vague, but Jacob didn't need to attend to know what it was about. Word had spread quickly. Neighbors had started, whispering at mailboxes, pausing longer on their morning walks, asking quiet questions in passing. The kite had been the spark. The dock was now the fire. He kept to himself for most of that week, answering only to his attorney and replying politely to the few neighbors who stopped by to offer quiet support. But then, a new notice appeared, slid under his door without a knock. Violation, obstruction of neighborhood harmony. No code cited, no reference number, no explanation, just a phrase typed in bold. One sentence beneath it, continued non-cooperation, may result in board-led action. Jacob read it 3 times. The wording was thinly veiled, not a rule, not a charge, just a threat passed off as regulation. A warning meant to intimidate. He folded it in half and slid it into a drawer without a word. But the next morning, his daughter found something that made him pause. A large metal screw had been pushed into the tire of his truck. Not enough to pop it, just enough to slowly flatten it overnight. A petty move, one that was easy to miss but deliberate in its execution. Jacob didn't speak to anyone about it. He simply walked back to the dock and changed the lock on the rental shed again, this time with a reinforced bolt and a camera mounted in the nearby tree, angled low and discreet. He was done sending messages. Now he was collecting them. 3 days later, another stranger arrived, not a neighbor, not a board member, a man in a gray polo shirt carrying a clipboard with the seal of the city inspection office on the corner. Jacob met him halfway down the trail. "I got a call," the inspector said. "Something about unauthorized fencing and surveillance installations." Jacob didn't flinch. "Everything's documented. You'll find the property lines in the county's own files." The inspector hesitated. "Yeah, I've seen them, just doing the paperwork." They walked the edge together. Measured the dock, logged the photos. Before leaving, the inspector paused. "You know, I've done 10 of these calls this year. This is the only one where the complaint wasn't about construction." Jacob nodded. "It's about control." The man didn't disagree. He just left. That evening, Jacob sat by the lake, staring out as dusk crept over the water. The air was calm, but tension lingered like a storm waiting for its cue. The board had pushed too far, too fast, and now they were unraveling in slow, quiet desperation. But Jacob was no longer defending his land. Now he was holding the line for everyone watching. The meeting was scheduled without fanfares, just a small announcement on the HOA website, tucked between notices about lawn trimming and noise curfews. But word had already spread. By the time Jacob arrived, the community hall was packed tighter than it had ever been. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years now stood shoulder to shoulder, arms folded, eyes sharp. The atmosphere wasn't tense, it was electric. Everyone had heard the whispers. Everyone knew something was coming. Jacob didn't sit. He stood near the back, folder in hand, watching as the board members took their seats at the front table like nothing had changed. The president cleared her throat and started the meeting with her usual calm tone. "Thank you all for coming. We'll begin with open forum comments." The room stayed silent. Then a man from the left row stood. "I'd like to ask the board." He began slowly. "Why our neighborhood funds have been used for 12 years to maintain a dock that, as of last week, was proven to be built on private land." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The president froze for just a moment, then reached for her folder. "The matter is currently under legal review," she said. "We're unable to comment until I have the county survey right here." The man interrupted, pulling out a printout. "And so do half the people in this room." More hands went up. One by one, residents began to speak, not just about the dock, but about other violations, hidden fees, unanswered requests, bullying tactics dressed as regulations. Jacob remained silent, until someone from the front pointed toward him. "You're the homeowner, right?" the man asked. "The one who filed the claim." All eyes turned to Jacob. He stepped forward slowly, no emotion on his face, no raised voice, just the folder, which he laid open on the board's table without asking. Inside were copies of everything: county maps, surveyor signatures, photographs, timestamps, the cease and desist, and the legal filing. "The dock crosses 28 feet onto my deeded property," Jacob said. "Your own meeting minutes from 12 years ago show you expanded it without permits. You collected rental income off of it, and when I asked you to remove it, you ignored me, then threatened me, then slashed my tires." Gasps echoed through the hall. The board members shifted in their seats, eyes darting. The president leaned into her mic. "We have no knowledge of any threats. That's because you don't respond to anything." Someone shouted from the crowd, "Unless it's about hedge height or mailbox paint." Laughter broke out, bitter, worn-down laughter that had clearly been waiting for a reason. Jacob didn't laugh. He placed one last document on the table, a notarized statement from Harris, the elderly neighbor who had voted for the dock expansion years ago. He confirmed that the board bypassed community input, that you acted without review, and you knew where the property lines were. A silence fell over the room so deep, even the air seemed to tighten. Then someone stood. "I move to suspend the current board pending investigation." Another voice, seconded. The board tried to protest, to call for order, but it was already gone. A vote was cast, hands raised one after the other, by the time the final count was done. The board president stood quietly, her hands resting flat on the table. Her eyes met Jacob's, not with anger, but with something closer to defeat. It had taken 12 years, a kite, and a boundary no one bothered to check. But the silence was broken now, and it wasn't just about one. homeowner anymore. The dock came down quietly. No announcements, no ceremony. Just 2 trucks, 3 men in uniforms. And a long afternoon of dismantling planks that had sat above the water for more than a decade. Jacob didn't watch it fall. He stood a few yards away, hands in his jacket pockets, while the final beams were pried loose and carried off in silence. Neighbors lined the shore in 2s and 3s, watching without a word, as if witnessing the end of something they didn't realize had been looming over them for years. By sunset, only the bare support posts remained, like bones of something that no longer belonged. The removal wasn't the only change. Within a week, the interim board held a town vote. New leadership was appointed, people who had spent the last years quietly enduring the same abuse Jacob had faced. They weren't loud, they weren't ambitious, but they listened. The violations disappeared from Jacob's mailbox. The threats stopped. And, without comment, the HOA quietly reimbursed the income it had earned from the illegal dock. Every penny, deposited directly into Jacob's account through a third-party escrow agent. Not as a settlement, but as an admission. Not one person from the former board ever spoke to him again. But it didn't matter. Spring broke across the lake slowly. The air softened, the trees turned greener. And the wind returned steady and sharp, slicing across the water with the confidence of something no longer being watched. One Sunday afternoon, Jacob carried out an old wooden box. His daughter opened it, pulled out the neon orange kite, and handed it to him with both hands. "Still flies," she said with a grin. He walked with her down to the shore. No signs stood there now. No warnings. No patrols. Just grass and sky. She ran, lifting the kite into the wind. It rose, caught, and soared higher than it ever had before. He watched it bob and weave against the clouds, the string trembling under her control, dancing over the place where the dock used to be. Jacob looked around. He wasn't alone. 3 families were out on blankets. 2 kids waited at the edge of the lake. 1 man tossed a frisbee with his dog. No one whispered anymore. They spoke freely. They waved. They flew kites. Later that evening, as the light dimmed and the lake turned golden, Jacob sat on the porch, sipping coffee. A single envelope slid through the mail slot behind him. He didn't move right away. But when he opened it, he found something unexpected inside. A handwritten note, short, careful. "You reminded us where the line is. We forgot. Thank you." No name, no signature. But it didn't need one. The story had already made its way through the neighborhood. Not the angry version the board tried to spin. Not the legal mess buried in cold paperwork. The real one. About the man who had stood still when others tried to move the ground beneath him. The one who didn't fight to win, but to draw the line where it belonged, and make sure no one crossed it again. Jacob folded the note and placed it on the windowsill. The sky above was wide, open and quiet, but not silent. Kites flew now, regularly, not just his daughters, but others. New ones, with long tails and bright cloth and unashamed color. There were no permits, no complaints, no citations, just wind and families, and a shoreline that finally felt like home.